Welcome to our monthly webinar series at Center for Healthy Sex. It's great to have you here. Center for Healthy Sex is a sex therapy center in Los Angeles. We specialize in sexual dysfunction, sexual anorexia, porn addiction, sex addiction, and love addiction. You can call our intake line anytime for any question or for a free consultation, and the number is 310-843-902. My name's Tom Bliss. I'm the project manager here, and I co-wrote Mirror of Intimacy. It's our daily meditation book on healthy sexuality, healthy relationships, with Alexandra Katahakis, who's our co-founder. She co-founded Center for Healthy Sex in 2005 with Douglas Evans, and their mission is to offer men, women, and couples a safe place to receive professional psychotherapy to resolve shame, guilt, deception, and other barriers to healthy eroticism. Today, I am very happy to introduce and welcome Greta Hassel. Great having you here. Greta is a marriage and family therapist with a practice in Santa Monica and Marina del Rey. She has a master's in psychology and a master's in divinity from, where is it? From Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. And she has worked at, she's been the director of clinical training at La Vie Counseling Center in Pasadena. She has been involved with Passages Addiction Cure Center from 2005 to the present. And she also worked here at Center for Healthy Sex, and she presented was one of the presenters at our Sex and Spirit series on Saturday mornings. I love on her website, gretahassel.com, she says she approaches her work by listening to the images of the soul, whereby symptoms previously deemed problems become transformed into messages. Her theoretical orientation combines object relations, ability, flexibility of the self, with transpersonal psychology, which looks to saints, artists, and great heroes and heroines for models of the growth-aligned nature of the human psyche. In this way, she seeks the development of the whole person, the intellectual, emotional, spiritual, body-mind, social, sexual, and creative aspect of each individual. Greta, I know you're offering a series in Marina del Rey. Do you want to say a word about that?
Yes, we also have created Love School, which is something I created with my husband for newlyweds and couples that have intensives that are offered for this training. And we also do a evening night of love, which is a great alternative for building intimacy and connection for couples. And I've also offer a Love, God, and Sex group, which is directly related to our topic today on religion and repressed sexuality.
So please welcome Greta Hassel.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
Welcome to religion and repressed sexuality. This is a subject that is very near and dear to my soul because it's actually been my own life path journey based on the early ways that I was in development deep in the Bible Belt in the South. And having traveled this path, I have the good news is that this is something that where openings are available and possible, and I recommend a guide who's been through this. So let me begin with where we're heading. And in this beautiful slide, I like to say, even though I've already let the cat out of the bag, what are the words that are said at the height of our pleasure? As you can see, oh my God, is something that is actually comes through us at times during these heights of pleasure. And I often like to say, well, what is that about? And my own personal inquiry is talking to people from different cultures to find out what do they say, because many people that I talk to find that during these states, these words come through unmeditated. There's no cognition involved here. It's as if consciousness comes into our bodies and speaks this fullness here. It's as if our bodies instinctively know that pleasure and God are deeply connected. We are close to being united with the divine again, and it's as if there's the remembrance of our oneness with Spirit is animated and evidenced in these particular moments. Even atheists say it, I find. And one of the other pieces that's so interesting to me is that if you were to look at the anatomy of the throat and of the vagina, I tell people in my Love, God, and Sex group, Google it and see and look at the anatomy, and the similarities are so striking. And this is important too, because in the heights of pleasure, in full body orgasms, that energy moves up, not merely in the genital area, but moves all the way up through the body and comes out so that our skin can hold more pleasure. And we have truly an embodiment of Spirit in these moments. So the question is, how is something that is so natural and so restorative of our energy, where we have these experiences of trust and mutual respect and radical acceptance, attraction, desire, and loving, get so separated here? And we have this very, very difficult situation shown on the next slide, where we have this split between our sexuality and our spirituality. So what happened? How can something that's so right go so wrong? And how is it that we have almost a biological predisposition to these feelings of contraction, by contrast, of shame and guilt and fear? We all know good girls don't. Save it for the one you love. Sex is dirty. So we have this disconnection and ambivalence about self-pleasure or masturbation. And Naomi Wolf, who writes in her book, Vagina, talking about the relationship between our own sexual relationship and the boosts of confidence and creativity and a sense of belonging to the whole that happens when women are open, and men are open to the pleasure that can stream through our bodies. So this virus, I think of this place that we'll be talking about today, of this sin that original sin that I will be giving a historical analysis of a bit today, that has created this separation from what is intrinsically whole. When this separation happens, we have the tragedies that we can look at. We have abuse by priests. Now, this can only happen when a child is not able to talk about their body and is not able to talk about something that doesn't feel right around their body. When we have a void of education, things are acted out, poor choices are made, body image issues aren't there isn't a place of acceptance and honoring of the uniqueness rather than the symmetry and perfection that we have plastered across billboards and magazines. We have difficulties of wait until you're married, and what happens when women aren't prepared for pleasure on the wedding night. There's just no way when a woman has waited that the body can ultimately open without being educated and informed and prepared. So these messages of repression, we see that guard against the access to the fertility of women. You know, thinking about the chastity belt, women veiling in parts of the world, genital mutilation. And what we know under those veils today is that underneath these women are feisty and wild. And I hear stories from my friends who have traveled to these parts of the world that women are throwing buckets of water on each other in spas and being very playful. And I'm grateful to hear that these women do know about the power and the beauty of their sexuality, even though they are outwardly veiled to the world. So religion, again, is in actuality an access to the sacred and the ecstatic realm. It is where we get relief from the mundane. And in societies, we know that in the earliest, more primitive societies, there would be these access to altered states through drumming and sacred ritual and dancing and chanting, and that would shift the body into states where that we could receive inspiration, could receive wisdom, could feel the enthusiasm of what it is to be alive. Enthusiasm is E-N-T-H-E-O-S. It has God actually encoded within these words of being spirit-filled. So I'd like to just say a word about why I am passionate about this topic, because of my own story of having been raised in Virginia in the Bible Belt. And the messages that I received actually are not like many that are even more abusive and constricting. Mine were merely that the messages about sex were more absent, not just talked about. My mother, who was very devoted to her two daughters, merely had three things to say about sex. Wait until you're married, don't get pregnant, and sex isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Well, I heard that at 15. And where did that lead me? Well, it ultimately led me to be somewhat of a late bloomer. And I remember that one of my areas of shame was when I was meeting with a spiritual mentor, and we were to confess the things that might keep us from being in communion and meditation and in our own private discipleship time with God, is that I would confess that I was masturbating, and that was like a big deal at the time. And so it ultimately left me living from the waist up rather than from a deeply embodied place. And this did not get supported, as when I was 25, I came out to the West and came to seminary, which was for me both good news and bad news. And hear the story about sin became a bit firmer, and there was one writing that actually changed the trajectory of my life. And I read this book that became Women, Patriarchy, and Abuse, I think it was called. And when I read this book, that original sin was not actually in the words spoken by Jesus. I fell to my knees. I was stunned that something that had been a cornerstone for me as someone who was a faithful follower was not in the Bible. And I remember actually feeling nauseous and sort of pulled things out of my body as if I was pulling lies and distortions out of my body. And so what we're going to talk about today is really looking more specifically here at how did we get here, looking at the impact of Genesis in Western civilization, looking at alternative perspectives, both ancient and modern, looking specifically at healing of shame, looking at the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical quadrants of that, and looking at the current trends in sacred sexuality. Now, I want to say that when we look at that first slide and we see this beautiful streaming explosion of energy where that sense of wonder of our sexuality and the ecstasy of pleasure there, and what I today am looking at as a kind of virus that has attached itself to us. There are many people that speaking about low self-esteem or original sin, and even one of the Native American traditions talks about Wetiko, which is the psycho-spiritual disease of the soul, where they also call it a mind virus. And in my meditation, I think about our DNA and think about these two strands in our DNA and how they're actually in harmony. And we think about these polarities of north and south, good and bad, hot and cold, masculine and feminine. And when we look at our DNA, there's a sense of partnership and balance and weaving together, and how I take root in how this wisdom that we find in our body is anchored as an image of our DNA. I think that we have a guide in that. Now, as we move into how did we get here, in our next slide, we look at this word breath. And it's actually translated as ruach, R-U-A-C-H in Hebrew, and pneumena in Greek. And when we look at the translation in Aramaic, in Hebrew, in Greek, we see that spirit is actually translated as breath. And I find that very, very hopeful for us today, because we have a sense of the embodiment of spirit. And when we breathe deeply, we bring spirit down into our body. And we think about, what does it sound like to think of Holy Spirit as holy breath? And let's just take a moment right now and breathe together. And as you inhale, allowing a deeper breath to come down from your heart, down into your hips, breathing all the way down. And then releasing and noticing how the calming effect that breath has in our body, and how it can bring us from even this conversation and being up here in our heads down into an experience of the body. And that this is where actually the parasympathetic nervous system is activated, which is a calming and soothing way that we come back into balance, and that our breath, that spirit being mindful awareness of spirit can come in a moment. Some of the traditions say God is closer than our very jugular. Now, how is that? Because our breath from moment to moment brings us into a state of presence and awareness and centeredness and groundedness. So with these distractions that come from our busy life, the sounds, the noises outside of us and inside our mind, each moment can be dropped in, being more deeply grounded by the attention on our breath. And that's how we can come back into our alignment between the body and the mind and spirit. So I'd like to give an important tour here about how we got off track with something that I think is not as well known about, but is a very important part of our heritage that we've gleaned. And I like to highlight this one piece of church history because I think it has so affected us. I'm talking about the legacy of St. Augustine, who was in the 4th century. He wrote Confessions. He's one of the big heavy hitters in the theological canon. And it wasn't until much later, even after I went to seminary, that I learned that he was the one that actually coined the term original sin, that actually is not really in the Bible. The original sin that we think of when we talk about us being flawed and because of Adam and Eve. It really wasn't until the 4th century that the fall from paradise in Genesis was interpreted to mean that the natural realities of sex in the body were instruments of God's eternal punishment. This is what Renee Eisler talks about. And so original sin negated our basic inherent worthiness and began to systematically destroy sexual desire. And I loved it. It wasn't until years later that I found Matthew Fox's work. He wrote about original blessing in the face of original sin. Let me just tell you a moment about Augustine, because he has influenced us so deeply. That essentially Augustine, at 18, was a playboy. He had a lot of sex. He was very promiscuous, and at age 18, he took a concubine and fathered a child through this mistress. And he actually fell deeply in love with this woman and was deeply attached. However, his mother, Monica, wanted him to marry up into high society. He was an orator, a man of rhetoric. And so she had plans for him to marry up. And though Augustine was deeply in love with this mistress for 14 years, he ripped himself away, obeying mommy's wishes, and moved to Milan. And he writes, broken, wounded, and bleeding. He has a young bride waiting for him that he's waiting to become of age to marry. And along the way, he converts to Christianity. And there he renounces any kind of sexual relations because he's tormented by his flesh. He rages within his soul. He reads Paul. Now, Paul is really one of the ones more responsible for all of this, not the writings of Jesus in the Gospels. So he reads Paul, make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires, and surrenders. And out of his ability to deal with, this is a time when reason is dominant over passion. And this is also a time of where asceticism and denial of the flesh is a great movement that's growing and growing. And so based on Augustine's inner torment, he searches for the one flaw in human nature that derails us, and from here he creates this doctrine of original sin. So here we have what is said that sin now becomes the first STD, the first sexually transmitted disease. So that's a lot right there. That's what a lot of us were spoon-fed with, and creates blockages in the flow of our bodies towards opening to the inherent energies within. Now, I'm going to give just another, on the slide you see it was not too long ago that in Christianity Today, the cover is of a picture of a baby that says, all are born sinners. There it is. Sin becomes the first STD for the slides. Now, there's so much more here. I've got Pope Gregory that comes up, and I just want to briefly say that what happens in the church is the monastic movement is now being structured, and the church is being built into separate gender communities, and the clergy are now submitting to celibacy. So the state and the church here is controlling and limiting sexual pleasure. So in the 11th century, almost overnight, with the Gregorian reform, clerical marriages are abolished. This is happening when people have families and wives, and it creates a bloodbath in Western Europe. There's rioting and suicides, and Raymond Lawrence, who wrote Sexual Liberation, calls this the authoritarian religious coup. So here I've gathered in the next slide, Spirituality and Health last year has on their cover, "Thou shalt have great sex." Now, I think it's just interesting that in the 21st century, we're looking and seeing these messages of permission that are still being given to override how powerful these other messages are that I've been talking about. I want to read to you a very interesting quote from Bishop Spong, who was an Episcopal priest for many, many years, and has written this beautiful summary that encapsulates, I think, what I'm wanting to say here. And he writes, "Religion is always in the control business. People don't understand. It's in the guilt-producing control business. If you have heaven as a place rewarded for your goodness and hell punished for your evil, you have control of the population. So create a fiery place and scare the hell out of people. It's part of a control tactic. Hell is the invention of the church, and the church fired its furnaces hotter than anybody else. The church doesn't like people to grow up because it can't control grown-ups." And he says, "Rather, we are an emerging people, not a fallen people. Our problem is not that we are born in sin. Our problem is we do not yet know how to achieve being fully human. The function of the Christ is not to rescue the sinners, but to empower and call you to be more deeply human than you've ever realized your potential to be. Salvation needs to be conveyed as an enhancing your humanity rather than rescuing it from it. Life," he writes, "is a startling and wondrous experience, and eventually we will discover God unfolding through the life of our consciousness, not as a parent figure in the sky." Thank you to Bishop Spong for his great contribution here. Now, there's so much. I think I'll end in terms of depression because I want to empower the listeners with ways to deal with these early messages. And I want to just draw your attention to the next slide, which talks about the Catholic Church. And I think most all of us are familiar with the Catholic Church's vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And have you ever thought of where on the body those vows correlate to? If you were to think about it, it actually relates and corresponds directly to our chakras, specifically our first, second, and third chakras, which are, by the way, below the waist. We think of the first chakra as connected to our finances and our fertility and the magic of life itself, and that's the vow of poverty. Our second chakra is our sexual and creative center, and that's the vow of chastity. The third chakra in the solar plex is the vow of obedience, and that is the place of our power. And when we sit and are not sitting up on our sit bones and are leaning over, we're actually sitting on our power center. And just by opening and sitting up on the sit bones, we actually open the spine, we open the flow of oxygen and flow. Our lungs can hold more. there's so much here that actually takes us right into the places of health and how we can heal. So I'm going to move through talking more specifically about Genesis and the fall and the Song of Songs, and look now at the healing interventions that we have for all these quadrants. So if we look at shame, which happens because of the secrecy and because of not being able to talk openly about sex, we know that shame is a physiological experience in the body. It gives us a sinking sensation in the stomach. We have sweaty palms, rapid heartbeat, lowering of eyes, rounded shoulders, no eye contact. And so that becomes in our cells. The slide I have now is Brene Brown's beautiful work where she describes shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we're flawed and therefore unworthy of love and of belonging. So in this experience, it separates us. And what's most important is to be able to talk about these messages. And that's why I created the Love, God, and Sex group, for women to come together, share our stories, find out we are so similar at our core, and to be able to experience the trust and melt those walls that keep us separate, that can lead to compulsive acting out or poor choices because we don't have the education and the support to understand how to navigate through this beautiful and wonderfully made body of ours. Shame is something that is important in terms of how we work with shame. We talked about sharing of the stories and also being conscious of our bodies. And our breath, as we spoke about spirit, breathing in spirit, is one of the ways that our body begins to fill and open. And if you just take a breath with me right now, and if you're sitting and driving, just come up on your sit bones, which will actually allow that small in your back to lift your rib cage. And let's just take a breath together. And when you do, I want to bring your attention to how much that takes us out of any kind of fight or flight or freeze or a hyper-aroused active physiological physiology in our body. And we're actually regulating our nervous system, bringing it into the parasympathetic system, which is soothing and calming. So what we're wanting, and sex really thrives in a place where our body is relaxed and open. I think the research is very interesting, and Stella Resnick talks a lot about what happens in the earliest development of our sexuality, that for the first 18 months, we're communicating right brain to right brain with our caregiver. If you think of breastfeeding, you've got the left eye to the left eye, the shortest point of contact between mother and infant. And often there's the eye gazing, there's the soft voice, there's the constant down-regulating of the nervous system for the infant to feel soothed and calmed and safe and secure. And these are the states that we want and really allow for the body to be open to, again, receiving more energy and more movement within our body. So another resource to counter shame is putting both feet on the ground here. And when you put one foot. If you're feeling really self-conscious or stuck, one of the ways to get grounded, getting grounded is the important art that's available for you. Shame lives in these conversations in our head and that little voice that's talking, and is the source of the critical negative voices that will cause us to withdraw, cause us to retreat, cause us to not have that confidence and that vitality that is available. So grounding, I want to make sure that everyone knows how to ground. And so what that means is taking that breath, taking another deep breath and bringing that down into our belly and into our hips. If you consciously move, even you can use your hands and bring your energy down into your hips. And exhale, and on this next breath, breathing down into your legs and down into your feet, and this time pressing your left heel into the earth and holding that for just a moment. And there's something very nice about holding that energy. You can release that. When you hold that for a moment, you're aware of slowing down and being in the present once again. Not so much living from the waist up or even from the neck up, which can happen with our inner chatter. And now to really create the most resourceful state here, now take a breath, breathing it all the way down into your hips, your womb, your pelvis, down into your right heel, pressing your right heel into the floor. And that creates a beautiful the advanced part of this exercise of getting grounded with intention. I think it's also important to realize that all of us have a threshold to our capacity for pleasure, depending on these messages that we've been given, that we need to open to this erotic creature that lives within us, to this wild, playful, excited part of ourselves that is embodied and needs to be able to hold more breath so that we can hold more of that life force energy in our body. When we take in that breath, the life force energy fills us more and more. And that's what's happening when people are talking about more intense orgasms, more full body orgasms, is that the experience is not merely genital. It's not just encased in our genitalia, in our genital area. It actually moves through the heart. It moves through the top of the head, just like we saw in the first slide, the Oh My God slide. The energy fills the whole body, this skin, which is the container. It fills all of us and is a beautiful, deeper experience. So in the next slide, we look at these different messages that are counter to that, where we end up attacking ourselves. And that's why it's so important to come together with other people to be reflected more accurately in terms of who we are, reflected about our beauty, the wondrousness of us. I love one of the Native American traditions when they reflect beauty. They talk about beauty is how well a person relates to other people, to animals, to plants, and to the environment. Seeing those attitudes. I'm looking at the chat here. Yes, please do tap in your questions, and thanks for hanging in with the audio challenges today. So we all need those kinds of attunement and reflections that allow us to see ourselves more accurately as who we are. In this next slide, it goes more into the different kinds of problems that can happen with shame, but I want to direct you to the healthy sense of shame, because shame also is a compass, and it really does allow us to make and discern good choices. And so there is that experience of taking responsibility for ourselves, being able to see the big picture, being able to re-engage with life once again. So I'd like to talk a little bit about just even the health of allowing our bodies to experience the flow of energy and of breath or spirit that flows through. And we know enough about how orgasms really keep the circulation of the blood flowing. It keeps our genital tissues healthy. Our heart rate increases, our respiration increases, so we get a bit of a cardiovascular workout, which is can't be overstated, and it provides the important hormones and endorphins such as dopamine and oxytocin, which are bonding for us and pleasurable, and are part of this chemical cocktail of romantic love, which give us this glow and part of our magnetism. Orgasms can help with sleep, migraines, menstrual cramps, and so much more. So these are some of the beautiful ways. Now, what I'd like to talk about as well as I move to the next slide, a little bit more on the physical quadrant. We've talked about the breath, and it's also important to move the body, and my favorite way that I talk about it with people, of course, going to the gym and walking, but dancing is really the fun way to do this. In the Love, God, and Sex group that I run, I see a question. I'll be there just in a moment. Thank you. In the Love, God, and Sex group, we dance every time, which moves the energy in the body and loosens up the kinks and is able to release stress. And we had one woman who was in the group who was a bit depressed when she came in, and she took to heart the dance and started to dance an hour every day and started to dress differently, and the light came back on in her eyes, and she was just awakening before our very eyes. It was very beautiful. I want to pause and ask and look at this question. Thank you for texting in. What are your thoughts on casual sex and slut shaming? With many women and young women embracing their sexuality, we still have opposition from puritanical Western theology. We certainly do. Thank you for your comments. And I think that this is one of the ways that has caused and connected to that repression. Of course, the word slut is being reclaimed by many in authorships, the ethical slut, so that a woman who chooses to have her own freedom about her sexual choices is the new archetype, and that we need another archetype that's not sex. And of course, I like Isis as a beautiful archetype of sexuality and spirituality, and we're all familiar how this beautiful goddess, Egyptian goddess of sexuality, has been perverted through the violence on the planet today. So we are one of the things that's so important is really honoring this freedom. As you know, in the Judeo-Christian story of Lilith, who wouldn't lay under Adam and walked out of the garden before Eve because of her own untamed sexuality, her own choice of who and when she wanted to have sex with, and that's part of our discernment. And I think talking about sex and being educated about our bodies and what's out there allows each individual to make good choices for their bodies and to be discerning about what is life-giving and what is true intimacy and mutual respect. So thank you for your question. And yes, we're still healing. In terms of the Isis, the goddess Isis, I have done work with Gina Ogden, the sexologist from Boston, and love her work. And I've created, recreating the Isis Wheel of Sexual Experience. And I'm actually offering this as a complimentary workshop in Los Angeles tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And the Isis Wheel is a medicine wheel that looks at these different quadrants, the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, ones that we're looking at today. And we work in this space of releasing that which no longer serves as sexuality and embracing, embellishing, and enhancing and calling in. If you're in the LA area, please go to loveschool.com, which is LUVSKOOL.com. You can read more about it. You can register at isiswheel.com. It's at a beautiful boutique outside of downtown Los Angeles, and I invite anyone on this call, please join me and register beforehand. That promises to be a very beautiful event. And I'm also looking at the question from our caller that about the larynx and the vagina. Yes, what I was saying, I think when the audio wasn't working as well, is that if you Google and go online the larynx and look at the anatomy of that, you'll be amazed at how similar it looks like the feminine vagina. It's striking, and therefore we see that the similarities, and that the similarities are also enhanced by women who are having stronger orgasms and more from full body to genital. It's the use of the voice that also moves the energy up and out and in a circuit. So sounding during sex, expressing yourself audibly with pleasure is another way to amplify the orgasmic experience. And so it's most notable when you can see that with your eyes. It's very fascinating. Let me come to these questions. I love hearing from you. We have a comment from San Francisco. Unfortunately, even the therapeutic model is to be in relationship, and monogamy is preached. If you do not adhere to that script, then there's something wrong with you. The vagus nerve connects the throat with the pelvis. Yes, the vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body that goes throughout our body, into our intestines, down into our spine, through our brain, and it's part of the accessing the parasympathetic system, part of that down regulation, that beautiful calming. Yes, that relationship still exists, and that's why we have this conversation, to be able to honor the choice and to look at, there are so many models that have mutual respect and that need to be honored. So thank you for your comment. And we have another comment from Florida, and any thoughts on working with highly religious clients who are rigid in their approach to sex and sexuality, which respects their beliefs, but which can foster an open dialogue about other facets that they may shun. Oh, yes, there's just so much. We talked about the breath and the spirit. Let me see if there's this next slide just talks about, I think, educating people, like look at the sacrum, okay? It's another place in the body, which is that place at the base of our spine. The word sacrum comes from sacra, S-A-C-R-A, which means sacred, holy, blessed, the place of the soul. How can it be that that part down there, which is considered dirty or to be shut off, when the earliest language had these beautiful spiritual, sacred languaging around them? I think that I draw great resources from the East, which is far more sophisticated because they haven't had the influence of the Adam and Eve story. When I was interested in healing, I took a trip with a shaman and went to Peru, and it was my first experience in being in a culture that had not cut its teeth on the story of Adam and Eve. They still believed they were living in the Garden of Eden. They were deeply connected to the lakes and to the mountains and to the animals, and having that experience was a deep, profound shift for me. I think that reading, I have many resources about reading, working with highly religious clients. And let's see, what was my last thought about the rigidity? I had a thought. Let me find it. Because there's the Song of Songs, which talks about celebration of the body in this beautiful poetry. In fact, in other religions like Judaism, the husband is to read the Song of Songs every week to his wife. How beautiful. I have a slide about that. Let me go back and show you how fair and pleasant you are. Your statue resembles the palm, your breasts the cluster. Methinks I'll climb the palm and grasp its branches. Let your branches be like grape clusters and such. I think it's important to look at these beautiful texts that are in the Bible that help highly religious clients see that this was something celebrated. And yes, I was talking about other parts of the world that didn't have this interruption of our sexuality and have free-flowing energy. Looking at Tantra, where the language about the body is something that actually opens up an understanding and connection to the body, where I think probably a portion of you are familiar that the vagina is talked about as the yoni, which means sacred cave or opening. And sex is a sacrament. The penis is talked about as the lingam, which means lightning bolt. It's another sacred language to be honored. And with in Thailand, in China, in India, there actually are trainings. They're training the women in the arts of sexual pleasure. So people aren't having to fumble around like most people from a religious background in the complete void of sexual education, find out through trial and error and get bruised hearts or have not as good experiences. And so these other cultures have a lot to teach us about working with sacred touch and gentle touch, compassionate touch, how to open the body through body techniques, and understanding the anatomy of the clitoris, which is more than a pearl. The women have, as Sherry Winston says, have erections all their own with our 3 to 4 inch erectile tissue that runs along the labia that create pleasure. There's this beautiful importance in the anatomy to be understood as a way to enhance pleasure, and of course access to the G-spot for women is a way that women can deeply amplify the energy that moves through. So these are some of the ways to work with people in my Love, God, and Sex group. I'm happy to talk with you more about that. You're welcome to email me at greta@loveschool.com, Florida, Winter Park, Florida, to discuss more. I'd be happy to talk with you, and that's GRETA at loveschool, spelled LUVSKOOL.com, and talk more about these ways to work with the beautiful embodiment of our spirituality, so that we can deepen the sense of inner being. And I'd love to invite you once again that tomorrow in Los Angeles we're doing the Isis Wheel of Sexual Experience at a beautiful feminine boutique. Please contact me again at Greta@loveschool if you're interested in that. And at Love School we also have other events for couples that you're welcome to visit at the end of the month. On March 28th, we're doing an evening of romance, which is a beautiful alternative for couples that creates an experience of intimacy and connection that supports couples coming together through appreciation and playfulness and all kinds of surprises. So there are beautiful alternatives. I also can do the Love, God, and Sex group through Skype as well. And so I look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for your interest, and feel free to contact me if you have further questions.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. Where am I? So we will be having, you can go onto our website to find our future webinar, guest webinar specialist. We have Kelly McDaniels for May that's going to talk about her book, Ready to Heal. We've also recently booked Dr. Tammy Nelson, Marcus Earl, Neil Cannon. So we've got some great webinars coming up. Thanks so much, Greta, for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.
I think the first half was